Really in great anticipation of today, especially this morning's Shannon lecture. And Pablo, you can introduce the introducer.
So good morning. Today we have a special lecture for a special person, a colleague to all of us, a friend to many of us, but I'm not allowed to say more about that. So please join me to welcome Emina, who is going to introduce the speaker for the 2019 Shannon lecture.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2019 Shannon lecture. Before proceeding with the usual, I would like, Pablo, how do all right. I would like to ask you to recognize also the recent passing of two previous Shannon lecturers. Elvin Berlekamp, who was the Shannon lecturer in 1993 in San Antonio, and Bob McLeese, who was the Shannon lecturer in 2004 in Chicago. They both just passed away a few months ago, and I would like to ask you and Erdal to join me for a moment of silence. Thank you. Erdal actually has some connections to both. He and Bob McLeese had some connections with Caltech, where Erdal did his undergrad studies. Bob McLeese was not at that time there, though. And he also is very well known for disproving one of Berlekamp's conjectures. But if you ask me who is Erdal Arıkan, it's kind of hard to say in very few words, and I don't want here to tell you what you can very easily read on Google. I just would like to say that I met him in 1995, and definitely since then I didn't see and haven't met anyone who had a more clear mind. So you may think that this discovery of polar codes is some kind of a serendipitous thing, but actually it's his life work one way or the other. Now that was in 1995 that I met him and realized how clear-headed he is, but it's only last year that I realized that actually he has this interesting ability to impart that on others. So I told him about a problem, which was not even a technical problem, and after talking a little bit with him, everything cleared up in my mind. Like those blurry pictures that all of a sudden become very sharp and you know what you need to do. And then I realized that Erdal Arıkan is by nature a polarizer. He has this polarizing filter in his head. And without further ado, I will ask Erdal to deliver his Shannon lecture.
Thank you, Amina. Thank you very much for being here this morning. Okay. Okay. So this morning I would like to walk you through some of the ideas that led to polar coding, starting from the very beginning and then making a retour and back to the original ideas. So let's just look at the setup. It's the channel coding problem. We have data it's encoded, transmitted through a channel, and decoded. What we want is three things. We want a low probability of error. We want the speed of transmission to be high. We measure it by the code rate, which is the ratio of the length of the data to the number of symbols we transmit. And we want low complexity of implementation. So in a famous theorem that we all know, the founder of our field, he proved that for a broad class of channels, there exists a number called channel capacity, such that arbitrarily reliable transmission is possible at any rate below the capacity. This theorem settled the trade-off relationship between the two performance criteria, namely rate and reliability, but it has no mention of complexity issues. But we need implementable coding schemes. So this talk is going to be about just one track of ideas towards this goal, among many, of course. So the complexity problem takes us, among many alternatives, to one type of solution, namely convolutional codes and sequential decoding. Okay, so this is the start of essentially my talk and road to polar codes, etc. So before I get into the details, let's just simplify the problem a little bit, the setting, I mean. So we are going to restrict attention to binary input memoryless channels. The channel input alphabet will be 0, 1, and there will be an arbitrary output alphabet, and throughout the transition probabilities are going to be denoted by the letter W. And we are going to focus on linear codes. These linear codes use the channel symbols with equal frequency, so the applicable capacity and cutoff rate are going to be given by those expressions. So there is no optimization over the distribution on the channel input alphabet, in other words. So I said convolutional codes. Convolutional codes are a class of linear codes introduced by Peter Elias with an encoder mapping of the form. The data is multiplied by a generator matrix to obtain the coded sequence, where the generator matrix is in row-reduced echelon form. Thanks to this row-reduced echelon form, the code words of a convolutional code can be represented as a tree, which in turn makes it easier to decode those codes. So here's a familiar picture of a circuit for a convolutional code and the associated generator matrix, which you see is in echelon form. It is sort of upper triangular. And here is the corresponding tree code. For every coded sequence, there is a path in this tree. One of the paths is the transmitted path, the correct path, and all the remaining ones are incorrect ones. And the decoding problem is a search problem for the transmitted path. There are many, so by formulating the decoding as a tree search problem, we open the door to the possibility of using any one of a number of tree search algorithms. One of them is exhaustive tree search, which is obviously too complex, but there are many tree search heuristics of low complexity nature. The one that we are going to be interested in is a depth-first search heuristic, and that brings us to sequential decoding. So sequential decoding is a depth-first search heuristic developed by Wozencraft that achieves the channel capacity if no limit is placed on the search complexity. No limit is placed on the time complexity, hardware complexity, etc. So it is going to get you to the capacity if you give it enough time and enough computing resources. On the other hand, if you limit the computational resources, then it will only get you to a certain rate called the computational cutoff rate, R0, in the sense that if you try to operate above the cutoff rate, the decoding complexity will grow exponentially in the number of bits that you decode. And at any rate below the cutoff rate, the decoding complexity will be bounded by an absolute constant per decoded bit. So in other words, this decoding algorithm solves the complexity problem for rates below the cutoff rate. So it stops short of solving the coding problem, because we would regard the coding problem to be solved if this were true for all rates below the channel capacity. So as a personal touch, let me explain how I got involved in this problem. In 1985, I completed my PhD thesis under Bob Gallagher's supervision on sequential decoding for multiple access channels. So at the time, multi-access channels was a topic of intense interest, Aloha channel, splitting algorithms, etc. And one approach, an alternative approach, was to use coding in the tradition of multi-access channels in information theory. So Bob suggested that I look at sequential decoding for the coding side of the multi-access communications problem. So sequential decoding had been used in space communications in 1960s, and in fact it was the first code in space, Pioneer 9, 1968, but soon afterwards it was superseded by other algorithms, notably the Viterbi decoding algorithm. And it had completely fallen out of favor. We may even say it has fallen out of favor ever since, because of the emergence of more practical, more powerful algorithms. On the other hand, sequential decoding was a great subject to study, to learn both information theory and coding. In studying sequential decoding, I came across two fascinating papers. Pinsker's 1965 paper on the complexity of decoding, and Massey's 1981 paper, Capacity, Cutoff Rate, and Coding for a Direct Detection Optical Channel. These papers showed that cutoff rate could be created as if it were not subject to a data processing theorem. Data processing theorem tells us that we cannot create channel capacity by doing pre-processing or post-processing operations around a channel, but pre-processing, post-processing did create cutoff rate in some sense. So this was a paradoxical situation, and understanding it was important, because if you could create cutoff rate, presumably you could boost the performance, the practicality of sequential decoding all the way up to the channel capacity. And in fact, this had been done by Pinsker. So that's the next road stop here, Pinsker's scheme. Pinsker, in his 1965 paper, he first noted the following. For a binary symmetric channel with crossover probability P, the ratio of the cutoff rate to the channel capacity, it went to 1 as the probability of error, crossover probability, approached 0. You see the graph here. another interesting fact to note here is that ratio is never below 1/2. So if you are a practical-minded engineer, you may say, okay, it's not a perfect solution, but operating at cutoff rate does not really sacrifice all that much, and then you may, in fact, lose interest in the coding problem, which apparently has happened. For that, I refer to Forney's 1995 Shannon lecture, in which he tells the story of the MIT information theory group dispersing after realizing that cutoff rate is only 3 dB away from channel capacity on an AWGN channel. So anyway, let's continue. Based on this observation, Pinsker came up in a 2-3 page manuscript with the following scheme. He combined Elias's product coding idea with the fact that we've just stated. So what is Elias's product coding idea? It is a concatenation scheme. There is an inner code and perhaps multiple outer codes. The inner code cleans up the channel, and the outer codes clean the residual errors. So in applying this scheme, Pinsker adjusted the rates of the inner codes to almost channel capacity. They operated near channel capacity. So he put no limits on the complexity of the inner codes. They were randomly chosen codes, let's say, and they were ML decoded. So the bit channels from each convolutional encoder to each sequential decoder at the outside was a near perfect channel. Sometimes, of course, errors occurred in the scheme, but the frequency of occurrence was small enough that the ratio of the cutoff rate to channel capacity was near 1. Okay, so if you clean up the inner channel, in other words, you are having the cutoff rate approach 1, which is what he wanted. So one thing to note here is essentially this thing, if we look at the big picture, it is a way of creating virtual bit pipes between the outer convolutional encoders and the outer corresponding sequential decoders. These bit pipes are near perfect. They are highly correlated. If there is an error in one, it is like that there is an error in the other ones also. But the crucial point is all of these bit pipes are memoryless. So successive digits at the output of the convolutional encoder are carried in different inner code blocks, which makes these bit pipes memoryless. Each bit pipe is a memoryless bit channel, but they are correlated. Correlation is ignored in decoding the convolutionally encoded data here. The sequential decoders outside work independently of each other. And Pinsker showed, it's a simple calculation after this point, that this scheme is going to achieve channel capacity using sequential decoding. So what Pinsker did is he was interested in the theoretical side of this result. Shannon had shown that arbitrarily reliable transmission is possible at rates below channel capacity. Pinsker essentially said that what Shannon promises can be done at constant complexity per decoded bit. So in a sense, he solved the complexity problem too. And here is an exact quote of what he said. I will skip it in the interest of time, but that's essentially what he says. So the question really is the following. Has Pinsker solved the entire coding problem? The answer is no, because the constant in Pinsker's scheme is extremely large. It involves the complexity of an ML decoder for the inner code. So it doesn't really solve the complexity problem in a real engineering sense. But it shows us that cutoff rate is a flaky notion. It can be created. So, and we learned from Pinsker how to boost the cutoff rate. Namely, we should be mimicking what he did. Create parallel bit channels. They can be correlated, encode them independently. You don't have to decode them independently. You may do something else to reduce the complexity and improve the performance. So that brings us to the next idea. Let's use multi-level coding in my Hirakawa 1977 paper. So this is very similar to Pinsker's architecture. The difference is, instead of an inner block code operating near capacity, here you have a one-to-one transformation. Essentially, the inner thing is not a code, it's a one-to-one mapping. And then instead of, and then there is a demapper here. The outer decoder, the inner decoder is replaced by something which calculates sufficient statistics for decision making for the outer decoders. And the decoding is done in a multi-stage fashion. The first decoder does the decoding, passes its results to the LLR calculator, demapper, and armed with the result of the first decoder, the demapper does a better job in supplying an LLR to the second decoder, and so on. So this system obviously includes Pinsker's scheme as a special case, and you can do with this one anything that you were able to do with Pinsker's scheme. By using information more economically, what we anticipate is this is going to reduce the complexity, maybe the size of the construction to achieve the same level of boosting in the cutoff rate. So here is once again the idea. These are the bit channels created by the multi-stage decoder. And by the chain rule of information, one can show that there is no loss of information in the multi-stage decoding. This is Imai Hirakawa result. Furthermore, if you arrange things such that, in such a way that you can also boost the cutoff rate to near channel capacity. So the question still remains, can we do this at low complexity? Because we have a one-to-one mapping, we haven't really said anything about the complexity of that mapping, nor the demapper. So there is also an additional complexity in this relative to Pinsker's scheme, in that the outer codes here are going to be operating at various different rates. In Pinsker's scheme, all the outer codes were operating at the same rate. This is much more complex if you want to apply it with a large construction size. No engineer would accept this as a practical solution, even if you had a boost in the cutoff rate. So luckily, both of these problems, namely the complexity of the inner mapper-demapper and also the complexity of the outer codes, both of them are solved simultaneously if we employ a recursive mapper. So this recursive mapper is the following. We start with this 2x2 matrix and construct higher order mappers by taking the Kronecker powers of this elementary kernel. Okay, so this gives us constructions of size 2 to the small n. So for each power of 2, we have a construction. Thanks to the recursive nature of the transform, it turns out both the mapping and the demapping operations can be done in complexity n log n. Moreover, as n becomes large, a polarization effect takes hold, which makes it possible to eliminate all the outer codes. So we have this polarization result, which says if we use that recursive mapper asymptotically in the construction size, the capacities of the bit channels that are created are going to converge either to 1 or 0. A fraction c will go to 1, a fraction 1 minus c will go to 0. I'm talking about the capacities. And a vanishing fraction will remain bounded away from both 0 and 1. So here is a picture of how polarization takes hold for a construction of size 32. These are the capacities of the bit channels that are created. As you see, some of them are very small, near 0, some of them are near 1, and then there are also in-between capacities. So to have a better visualization of what is happening, if we sort those bit channel capacities and replot them, we see this one. So this is not the natural decoding order, but here the capacities are just sorted with respect to their size. If we go to a construction of size 128, this is the picture, and this is the sorted picture of the capacities. You can see clearly here that we have some convergence occurring. Capacities are clustering around 0 or 1, and then a transition interval. So the fraction of channels which do not cluster around 1 or 0, that fraction is going to disappear as n increases. That's what the channel polarization theorem says. Okay, now, we've understood, let's say, the channel polarization. How do we put this in use? What do we do? Well, we are going to use it in assigning the rates of the outer convolutional encoders and decoders, rather just the encoders. So what do we do? I mean, if the capacities are clustering around 0 and 1, are we going to use all the precise capacities? Let's try simplifying it by doing the following. We will either use rate 0 outer codes or rate 1 outer codes. So those channels whose capacity is near 1, we are going to use rate 1. So we will be ambitious. We are going to be operating a little over their capacity. And then when you set the rate equal to 0, what is happening is you are going to be sacrificing the capacities of those channels whose capacity is not yet near 1. So there will be some lost sacrificed capacity. So that's the idea of polar coding. But before I get to it, let me show you another graph, and this graph is important for understanding what I will say in the rest of the talk. This is essentially the same picture. So let's go back to this one, the unsorted capacities in the natural decoding order. We will integrate this, okay? Look at the cumulative sum of those capacities. If we do so, we obtain the red solid curve here, the cumulative polarized capacity. If we do a similar thing for the cutoff rates of the bit channels, we obtain the red dashed line. The blue lines belong to the raw channel capacities and the raw cutoff rates. So what we see here is a boost in the cutoff rate, indicated at the far right-hand side. We see an improvement in the cumulative, in the sum cutoff rate. We don't see any improvement, and we don't see any loss in the cumulative capacity. That's a good thing, obviously. We don't lose any capacity, but we gain in cutoff rate. So this is the sole reason why we are doing this, to gain something in the cutoff rate. Okay, so back to the multi-stage system. Now we insert the recursive mapper in place of the mapper box, And then there will be the corresponding recursive demapper here. And then we will do the rate assignment as I've indicated. For those bit channels whose capacity is near 1, well, for a rate k over encode, we need k carriers, k convolutional encoders operating at rate 1, and the remaining ones are going to operate at rate 0. Which of those k bit channels would you choose? Obviously, you would choose the ones with the highest bit capacities. If you do so, you obtain a polar code. That's what a polar code is. So a polar code is a much simplified version of this multi-stage decoding system. Essentially, by setting the rates of the outer codes equal to 0 or 1, we are either fixing the input of a bit channel, or we are transmitting data uncoded through a bit channel. And the sequential decoders also trivialize. They turn into simple decision-making boxes with essentially no complexity. So essentially, the entire system consists of the inner recursive mapper and the corresponding demapper. The demapper is called a successive cancellation decoder in the terminology of polar coding. So this picture shows the rate assignment with polar coding. The black solid line here shows the cumulative rate. So notice that it is adjusted so that it remains below both, it remains below the cumulative capacity for the synthesized bit channels. That's important because if it went above the cumulative capacity, then if you try to do sequential decoding, as you do in successive cancellation decoding, you would run into complexity problems. You would see exponential search complexity if you have an information bottleneck, a deficit in the amount of information supplied to the ith stage decoder. If it is below the amount of information supplied to the ith encoder, the cumulative information versus the cumulative rate, you want to maintain a positive information, an information above the amount of uncertainty that you put into the system. If you want to do sequential decoding, if you want to do it blockwise, you can do whatever you want, but then it's not going to be a low complexity scheme. So the name of the game is to design a rate profile so that it stays below those, the red solid line. If your intention is to use sequential decoders no matter what, then you should also keep the rate profile below the dashed red line. So here are the properties of polar codes. The final line here is important. It is saying that even though we've eliminated all the outer codes, the inner code, consisting of the recursive mapper and demapper with the polar code rate assignment, is sufficiently reliable to achieve channel capacity. The frame error rate goes to 0. Now here is what you obtain if you do a simulation. Okay, so a theoretical point has been made. We have a constructive method of achieving channel capacity. On the other hand, the performance is far from being impressive. So the red solid curve here is the AWGN dispersion bound, finite length performance bound, and the black curve is the performance of a rate 1/2 polar code of block length 128. So this is not impressive. The performance here is below the performance of the state of the art. There is a weak performance. Can we fix it? So we've oversimplified. By eliminating the outer codes, we've oversimplified the construction. Okay, so the outer codes were responsible for boosting the reliability. The inner code boosted the cutoff rate, provided polarization. The outer codes were there to provide, in Pinsker's scheme, recall, to provide reliability at very low cost. We've sacrificed them in the name of getting a constructive scheme. So we should perhaps retrace our steps and introduce an outer code, a concatenation scheme. And this has been done. So Tal and Vardy, 2011, they introduced an outer CRC and used a sophisticated search algorithm, list decoder, which improved the performance very significantly. You see it as the magenta curve here. There is still some gap between the best achievable performance and what is achieved by list decoder. What else can be done? I mean, still we are sacrificing some capacity. Information is lost because we are freezing the inputs of some of the bit channels, and we can never recover them. So the next thing to do is try to make use of those fractional capacities. If you try to do it using multiple outer convolutional encoders, it will be too complex. So instead of using multiple outer codes, we are going to use just one code. One code, an unusual type of convolutional code. It will be a tree code, a convolutional code, to be more specific, with its rate adapted to the polarization profile. So what we are going to do is, it will be very similar to polar coding. In polar coding, there is rate profiling. You choose the carriers that you are going to use as data carriers very carefully. That's what rate profiling is. Between the rate profiler and the polar transform, we are going to insert a convolutional encoder, a convolution operation. Okay, so the rate profiler is very similar to what we do in polar coding. For example, if you want to construct a rate 1/2 code of this type, you are going to choose for a code of block length 8, you need to choose 4 data carriers, and you choose them any way you like. The recommended way would be to choose them as the ones that have the highest channel capacities, and after you choose them, you carry the data indexed by a set, and then you freeze the inputs of the remaining bit channels. So here are 2 sample example rate profiles. One of them is the polar code rate profile that we've seen before, and then we have the Reed-Muller code rate profile, shown in pink. The convolution operation, the next block in the scheme, is a simple convolution. So this is really a rate 1 type of convolution operation. It's a one-to-one transformation. It's an invertible transformation. So we've expanded, in other words, inserted data into a transform input, convolution input V. V now carries both the data and also some frozen bits, but the transform, convolution from V to U, is a one-to-one operation. So more specifically, it can be represented as an upper triangular Toeplitz transform of this type. We have a correction polynomial, C0, C1, C2. It can be implemented as a simple shift register system, just like we do in convolutional coding. The polar transform is the same as before, and then we have an appropriate decoder here. So let's look at the big picture again. So this polar transform and the metric calculator, which is basically the demember, they create a polarized channel for us. And then the rate profiler and the convolution, they provide an irregular tree code. And then we have a tree search algorithm of some sort here. So this gives us a code whose aim is to make use of all the available information in the polarized channels, whether they are polarized to the extremes or fractionally. So here are the list decoder and the successive cancellation decoder results. And then this is the result by this new scheme. polarization adjusted convolutional code with the Reed-Muller profile and using sequential decoder. So this one comes right next to the dispersion bound. The gap is almost invisible, and it is a low complexity scheme because we are using sequential decoding, so the complexity of this scheme is also fulfilling Pinsker's criterion for practicality with a much smaller constant. So how do we explain the improved performance here? Well, we already have seen it. We are not sacrificing any fractional capacities. We are making full use of them. We are bringing back the concatenation scheme, okay, and we are using sequential decoding to achieve low complexity decoding. So I have some final remarks here and some open problems. In linear algebra, lower upper decomposition, LUD, is a method for solving systems of linear equations at low complexity. So this scheme reminds me of LUD applied to the case of solving equations when the equations are corrupted by noise. Here in coding, we have the freedom to design the lower and upper triangular factors of the generator matrix as we please, so as to make the decoding easy and performance good enough. So we can use the freedom to our advantage. We cannot do it in the case of arbitrary linear equations and so on. So here we've in fact done it. We've chosen as one of the triangular factors the polar transform, and the other triangular factor is a convolution, a Toeplitz operator. We are in fact using upper-lower decomposition because the multiplication is from the left-hand side. Okay, so some open problems. This scheme has not yet been analyzed totally. There are no existing coding theorems, precise coding theorems. I presented to you simulation results. So it may be interesting to analyze it further. And very important problem is to develop methods for rate profiling. How should we do the rate profiling? Interestingly, the performance that I have shown you is the rate profiler corresponding to a Reed-Muller code. The polar code rate profile does not achieve the same performance. It is still better than list decoding, but it does not. It is not as good as the Reed-Muller rate profile. So one may explore other LU decompositions for error correction coding purposes, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erdal. I think Erdal heard how time is important for me, so he finished way within his time limit, and we have lots of time for questions. Anyone? Sorry.
Thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. So my question is, can you speak to the application of this polar coding idea to source coding?
In polar coding, it has been applied to source coding, and in fact, it is much easier to do polar coding with source coding because the encoder already knows whether the decoder is going to make any mistakes in decoding. Okay, if that's the case, the encoder can send some extra information for correction. In other words, we have automatic feedback in source coding. If you are asking the same question relative to what I presented now, I haven't thought about it, so that's something to look at, I think.
It's on? Yeah. Going back to the idea of the Pinsker idea, there was a similar thing that Jelinek did called bootstrap, hybrid bootstrap sequential decoding, where there was a set of parallel convolutional encoders with an overall parity check, which had the effect at the decoder of basically polarization of the decoders and stuff. And he was able to get improved cutoff rate. He had upper and lower bounds, as I recall. Fred Jelinek. Yeah. You remember that. How does that fit into the picture that you drew, the Jelinek work, where he got improved cutoff rates, not the capacity, got upper and lower bounds, but lower bounds on cutoff rate that were above the normal cutoff rate?
I know all of these papers. I didn't mention them because, because of time, etc. So I wrote a paper 2016. So I believe I have mentioned not only Jelinek's work, but there are two more works, Falconer, David, yes, and then there is Erwin Stiglitz. So both of those were MIT PhD theses. I have gone through all of them. David Falconer's result, he proves he can get to channel capacity by using parallel streams of sequential decoders. And then there is the sequential decoders are the inner codes, and then there is a Reed-Solomon code outside. So the Reed-Solomon code, whenever it helps, in other words, some of the sequential decoders are lagging behind. Some of them have no trouble advancing. So the laggards are helped by the outer RS code. So you must remember this, perhaps. So these things are, none of them have been, picked up by engineers because they were too complex. And Erwin Stiglitz's thesis is also very interesting. I mean, there is a wealth of literature out there. It is worth, revisiting them. People at MIT have spent 10 years studying sequential decoding. And you have many papers on sequential decoding. You designed, those the connection polynomials, Massey, Costello connection polynomials, and so on, which went into the space, right? So you should tell us the story, and then, yeah.
It's basically a complexity issue then, as far as those kind of schemes.
So I also didn't mention the problem with sequential decoding. Although below R0, the expected computation is finite, the variance of the computation is not. And then there is the buffer overflow problems and so on. On the other hand, this polarization also helps reduce the higher moments of computation, because as the cutoff rate approaches channel capacity, the variation in computation is reduced.
Dan, there is a question behind you.
The thing I'm interested in, or maybe it's related, is to deal with polar coding for the case when you don't know the channel. Maybe try to be a little universal. It seems natural that you can add or subtract more and more channels to adapt to the channel condition. But I really didn't see an elegant way to do it within polar codes. So can you comment on that a little bit?
Okay, great question. The other questions were also great, but this one, no, I mean, this is really something I should have mentioned. I just wasn't sure that I would be able to finish it on time. So this cumulative approach also makes the polar code a lot more robust. Okay, so what you really want is a rate profile matched to the information profile. Yes. So let me explain it. So here it is. So what we care here is the red curve, the dashed red curve is what is relevant here. That's the cutoff rate curve. So, and then you have the rate profile. Now, if you have some channel uncertainty, variations in channel parameters, etc., the dashed red curve is going to move around. Yes. But it is the, okay, maybe need to go a couple of slides back. In polar coding, without this cumulative approach, what you are doing for rate assignment is you are assigning rates to individual bit channels. So if that perturbation in the channel turns a good channel into a bad one, there is no way you can recover, okay? There is no way you can recover. Here, we don't care that much, because if there is some fluctuation in the capacities of the bit channels, that's going to be smoothed out by the integral here, by the cumulative sum. As long as you keep your rate profile below the cutoff rate curve, you are going to be okay. And in fact, if you look at the dynamic behavior of the sequential decoder, this one is the expected value. It's the cutoff rate. Like all, capacity, cutoff rate, etc., these are averages over an ensemble. What determines the dynamical behavior of the sequential decoder is going to be that random variable, mutual information, random variable, etc. So that random variable will cause the information profile to dip below the rate profile. And whenever that's the case, depending on how much that dip is, there will be an exponential complexity, extra search effort required. Okay. So what you really want is to keep the two curves, the rate profile and the cutoff rate profile, as separate from each other as possible. On the other hand, that you could do simply by bringing down a rate one slow rate profile here. That's going to sacrifice some capacity. So you need to find a balance. The rate assignment problem, I repeat, is an open problem. It's a good problem to look at. You want to, the minimum distance also plays a role here. I don't fully understand it, but because the Reed-Muller rate profile, it gives you better performance than the polar rate profile. It's an indication that minimum distance of the code is also having some effect, at least at this block length. Now, I should also mention that if you use the polar code rate profile, the search is a lot faster. The sequential decoder runs faster, but it doesn't give you the same performance.
May I have another question?
Erdal, about polarization for network problems, and those network problems that do not break to point-to-point channel, like the multiple access channel. You cannot break them through superposition. Any comment of that? If they break to point, then use this stuff.
I believe you can do, and it has been done, you can polarize and apply polar coding to multi-access channels. Network.
Where the theoretical result does not break into superposition. General, like general problem, when it does not break to superposition, like multiple access we can have, when it does not, that's the issue. When it does, okay, of course.
Okay, let me see if I understand correctly. Let's say we have, for the broadcast channel, a superposition coding scheme. That was the alarm. Okay, let me repeat. Let's say you have this superposition coding scheme for the broadcast channel.
When you have superposition, it works. Because you end up with point-to-point channels. Then it works. But there are many multi-user network problems that do not break.
Okay, so Shlomo is making the following point, I believe. So there may be a point to multi-point channels where the channels are incompatible with each other. In other words, the polarizations are not really degraded versions of each other. And then what do you do? I think I can speculate a little. Although there are some methods of universal coding which we can introduce to solve these problems, I think this scheme is also going to solve them quite naturally, because this one really doesn't depend on, it is robust. It is not that fragile. You don't have to really find the right coordinates to use as carriers of information, okay? So, because you see now what we are doing is we are going back to multi-coding, multi-stage decoding. We are really back to Imai Hirakawa method. So anything that you can do with such methods, you can also do them here at low complexity.
All right. One more question, and then I have a couple of announcements to make.
What happens when the successive interference cancellation is imperfect?
I couldn't hear, sorry.
What happens when successive interference cancellation that you have to use to decode the code is imperfect?
So here, in fact, we are not, in this scheme that I presented this morning, we are not using successive cancellation decoding. This is a tree search algorithm. It goes back and forth. It is doing backtracking search. That first backtracking search in the simple successive cancellation decoding algorithm does not have backtracking. It is mainly useful for proving a theorem, okay? And later improvements in performance show that that basic polarization scheme should not be used as a standalone code. It should be used as an inner scheme surrounded by, some outer codes, outer schemes which will boost the performance and make it more robust.
All right. Before I actually ask a final question and thank Erdal, I would like to tell you that there will be a session tomorrow honoring Robert McLeese at 1:15. It's a memorial session with no other parallel sessions. Another thing is that I would like to remind you that this building will close at 2 p.m. today for those of you who came late, so don't get locked in here. And then I would like to thank Erdal and actually ask him, is there such thing as a birthday of polar codes? Is there a particular date or time that you would say, this is the birthday of polar codes? That is when I know what it is.
When was the birthday? Okay. I can pinpoint that one because it was just one single day when I realized that the sum of the cutoff rates of the two channels created by that 2x2 construction is always greater than or equal to 2 times the cutoff rate of the original channel. That was the breakthrough, because then I saw that one could just use some recursion to make it go all the way to channel capacity. So it was in 2005, late 2005.
Thank you, Erdal, and thank you all for coming. Congratulations again.